Hello and welcome to episode 26 of Art Snaps. Thank you for joining me. I'm Katie and I work at Swindon Museum and Art Gallery, where we're very fortunate to have a large and fabulous collection of modern and contemporary British art. Unfortunately, at the moment, Swindon Museum and Art Gallery has to remain closed. So I've been making these 10-minute talks about Swindon's art collection to help spread the joy about what we have and all of the wonderful themes and artists and movements that are covered within Swindon's art collection. And this week I'm going to cover sculpture, which is quite broad really, but most of the art snaps so far have focused on 2D work because so much of Swindon's art collection is 2D. We're quite well known for our paintings and drawings and prints. But we do have some really interesting 3D work, and I've covered some of it in these episodes. We've looked at the Studio Ceramics collection in episode 9, and in episode 10 I looked at a really interesting piece of work by Michael Craig Martin called The Box That Never Closes. So I've covered a little bit, but I think it's about time I looked more specifically at sculpture from Swindon's art collection. In comparison to the 2D work in the collection, the sculpture collection is pretty small, but we have some really interesting pieces and some really interesting stories which go with them as well. And I'm going to begin with Stephen Tomlin's bust of Virginia Woolf from 1931. Now, the first thing to say about Stephen Tomlin is that he was associated with the Bloomsbury Group, who were an artistically progressive and very liberal-minded group of artists and writers and thinkers who were working in the first half of the 20th century. And sorry to keep plugging previous episodes of the Art Snaps, particularly if you've already heard them before, but if you would like to know more about the Bloomsbury Group, do take a look at episode 13 of Art Snaps because we focus on them and their presence in Swindon's collection there. Just to give you a bit of background on Stephen Tomlin then, he was from quite a well-to-do family. He was the youngest son of an influential judge and he was educated at Harrow School, and in 1919 he went to New College in Oxford to study classics. But he just did 2 terms there before leaving to study sculpture, and he went on to become a pretty successful sculptor of portrait busts. He was known to be a very charming, intelligent and energetic member of the Bloomsbury Group, but ironically the one person that he couldn't charm was the subject of his most famous bronze bust, depicting Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf is of course one of the most important writers of the 20th century, having produced the seminal feminist essay A Room of One's Own and a number of significant novels like To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway. She was also a member of the Bloomsbury Group, along with her sister Vanessa Bell, who was a distinguished Bloomsbury artist. Tomlin was keen to make a portrait of Woolf when he first met her in 1924, and though she was very uncomfortable with the prospect of sitting for the portrait, she finally and begrudgingly agreed 7 years later in 1931 to let Tomlin make this bust of her. In fact, she wrote some great letters which attest to her negative attitude toward having her portrait done. In July 1931, in a letter to Dorothy Bussey, she wrote, quote, "The man I hate most in the world, your nephew, Tomlin, has me by the hair. I waste afternoon after afternoon perched in his rat-ridden and draft-riddled studio. Can't escape," unquote. So, not exactly the words of a happy woman. And after only 6 sittings, Tomlin had to abandon the bust, and what we have is in fact an unfinished portrait. But it's full of character and expression nonetheless, and I want to quote her sister Vanessa Bell's insights into the bust at length because I think they sum it up pretty well. Quote, "It is not flattering. It makes Virginia look older and fiercer than she was, but it has a force, a life, a truth, which his other works, those I have seen, do not possess. Virginia gave him no time to spoil his first brilliant conception. Irritated, despondent, reckless, he pushed his clay into position to give, whilst there was still time, the essential structure of her face. Her blank eyes stare at us as though in blind, affronted dismay, but it is far more like than any of the photographs." Unquote. So the impact of the work lies in its immediacy. in its lack of polish and flattery. Tomlin simply didn't have the time to think of the best way to represent Woolf because she didn't want to sit for him, so he had to make do with a kind of quick, instinctual response, and the result is something that's very animated and engaging. I want to move on to another piece now, and as you can see, this is a very different kind of sculpture to what we saw from Tomlin. What Tomlin presented is a portrait bust, which is quite a traditional way to represent someone of importance, and it's something that goes back to classical antiquity and of course still remains an effective way to immortalise someone in a solid and lasting way today. But I want to turn to a distinctively 20th century kind of sculpture now, one that was born of new ideas and isn't concerned with a direct representation of someone or something. Many artists in the 20th century were very much thinking about what can be represented and how that can be expressed, and sculptors in particular were looking at new ways in which three-dimensional forms can interact with space. And a lot of this thinking was bound up with the development of abstraction in art, which of course dominated this time. And what strikes me about this particular piece, which is called Winged Idol, and was created by Roger Lee in 1963, is that it's very abstract in nature. In sculptures like this, as I've said before, we don't so much see an accurate representation of something, it's more about the focus on form, space, and balance. It has this very powerful T-shaped structure which suggests outstretched wings, but rather than being organic, they kind of have a linear quality to them, and they have those really interesting angular forms cut into the bronze, which to me almost looks futuristic. They give it movement and they allow the light to interact with it in a really interesting way. At the same time, it seems to reference something quite sacred, something much more grounded in traditional ideas of ritual and worship. It could be a crucifix, a totem, or perhaps even an effigy. Though I don't think that Lee intends it to be any one thing. But I think that this mixture of traditional and futuristic visual languages is really interesting, and this is also reflected in the materials that he's used, which are bronze and wood. So they're quite traditional materials, but they're presented together so that we can really appreciate their different characteristics and the ways that they interact formally with one another. And we can also see Lee's understanding of how to achieve balance and harmony through these materials. I want to end by talking about this stunning contemporary piece by Wiltshire-based artist Vanessa Elms, who creates flowing forms with fine strips of porcelain which reflect light with incredible luminosity and intensity. Mobius Knot is a recent addition to the Swindon collection. It was made in 2016 for an exhibition at Swindon Museum and Art Gallery called From Where I'm Standing, where a number of Wiltshire-based artists who work with the medium of clay responded to artworks within Swindon's collection. And this piece by Elms was made in response to Peter Simpson's fungus form from the 1970s, with its incredible delicate layers of porcelain. So talking about this work gives me an opportunity to talk about Swindon's collection of British studio ceramics, which spans the 20th century to today and shows a gradual breaking down of the divide between fine art, which is traditionally seen as high art, and craft, which has traditionally been seen as a lower art form. Ceramics have previously been in the category of craft, but ceramicists in the later years of the 20th century began to experiment more and more with the sculptural potential of clay, pushing it into the realm of fine art sculpture. In recent years, artists have continued to push those boundaries, finding increasingly experimental and expressive ways to create ceramics. So it has become increasingly difficult to draw a line between studio ceramics and sculpture, and I think Swindon's collection represents this shift really well through pieces like Mobius Knot. And that's it from me for today. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope that gave you a little bit of an insight into some of the three-dimensional pieces in Swindon's collection. As always, I'll end by encouraging you to follow us on Facebook at Art on Tour 2020, Instagram at Swindon Gallery Art on Tour, or on our website, which is www.swindonmuseumandartgallery.org.uk/artontour. Thank you very much for listening, and bye for now.